The 2018 NFL Draft is in the books, and the Miami Dolphins accumulated a class of 8 players headlined by Minkah Fitzpatrick out of Alabama with the 11th overall pick. A couple of notes before I get started. This marks the first time in Miami's 53-year history the team did not select an offensive lineman in the draft. It's also the first time since 2007 that the Dolphins did not make a trade during the draft itself. All right, let's get down to business. Overall, I thought this was a solid, purposeful draft by the Dolphins. There were some definite highlights and overwhelming positives, but they also left themselves open to criticism for certain decisions, and more specifically, based on the positions they did not address. Every year, there's always a balance the front office makes in the draft, needs versus best player available. There was a blend of those this time around for Miami, in my opinion. It's very clear that the Dolphins met some of those needs, and there are arguments to be made that they came away with the best player available at certain points in the draft, and particularly in the first round, which I'll get to in a moment. They picked up a star safety defensive back, a tight end tandem, a pair of linebackers, a running back, cornerback, and a kicker, so they doubled up at 2 positions. But in my mind, missed out on a pair of obvious needs, the interior of the defensive line and at quarterback. Let me throw out my disclaimer that I do every year before I go any further. None of these draft classes, from the Dolphins to any of the other 31 teams, can be truly evaluated for at least 2 years, and probably longer to be fair. So no one, not me, not Mel Kiper Jr., Mike Mayock, Todd McShay, or your draft pundit of choice can say definitively whether Miami had a great draft or not. However, this draft is a mix of some very good and some very questionable. My other disclaimer is that Mike Tannenbaum, Chris Greer, Adam Gase, and the entire scouting and player personnel departments do exhaustive research and work with the ultimate goal being to get these decisions right. They're paid a lot of money to do so, and let's hope they did. But if they didn't, that group may not have a long-term future with the organization. However, only time will tell. Let's start in the first round. Minkah Fitzpatrick is a home run. As the top 10 was shaping up, the Dolphins couldn't ask for much more if they were looking to get the best defensive prospect available. Once Josh Rosen went off the board at number 10, Miami had its pick between Tremaine Edmonds, Derwin James, Vita Vea, Daron Payne, Jair Alexander, all talents on the defensive side of the ball and all available to them. They ultimately decided on Fitzpatrick, and nothing against those other players, but I thought this one was a no-brainer. Some projected Fitzpatrick as a top 5 prospect in the draft. The Dolphins get him with pick number 11. It speaks volumes that he was on the field playing a major role as a freshman at Alabama during a national championship season, and it also speaks volumes that he's one of Nick Saban's favorite players that he's ever coached. It's also noteworthy that he came away with 9 interceptions in 3 seasons and set a Crimson Tide record with 4 INTs returned for touchdowns. The guy is a playmaker, and maybe most importantly, can cover the middle of the field. I've got some sobering statistics for Dolphins fans that I'll tell you momentarily, with the assurance that these numbers are bound to improve with the presence of Fitzpatrick on this defense. No team allowed more receptions by tight ends than the Dolphins did last season, with 94. Opposing quarterbacks completed 70% of their passes when they targeted tight ends against Miami. And the Dolphins tied for 28th in the league with just 9 interceptions on defense, and tied for 29th with a minus 14 turnover margin. One more impressive note of many on Fitzpatrick: he won the Chuck Bednarik Award as the nation's top defensive player and the Jim Thorpe Award as the nation's top defensive back as a junior in 2017. He becomes the 3rd player in NCAA history to win both of those awards, joining cornerback Charles Woodson from Michigan and fellow cornerback Patrick Peterson at LSU. That is some impressive company. Strangely enough, this is the 2nd consecutive first-round pick with which the Dolphins didn't have much contact prior to the draft. It was the same with Charles Harris. For whatever reason, maybe they were being covert, maybe they didn't think Fitzpatrick would be available, but they didn't have him in for a visit. It worked out well, though, because they ultimately can now call him a Miami Dolphin. I love this selection, but it did make me wonder what his role will be. Chris Greer promptly said in his post-first-round press conference that Fitzpatrick will play safety, which begs the question, what will happen to TJ McDonald? It's up to Matt Burke to figure that out, but don't get me wrong, it's not a terrible problem to have. 3 talented players at the same position if we include the Pro Bowler Rashad Jones, but he's not going anywhere, and Fitzpatrick's going to play. we have to acknowledge that McDonald and Jones didn't play well together because they're so similar. Fitzpatrick should complement Jones much better, but what will they do with McDonald? I'm not sure if they transition him into some sort of hybrid linebacker role or if Fitzpatrick plays a hybrid safety slot corner position, but you have to really question the decision-making of this front office when you consider it rewarded McDonald with a 4-year, $24 million contract during the 2017 season. The likes of Mike Tannenbaum and Chris Greer didn't do so while McDonald was on the field making plays. They did so while he was serving an 8-game suspension for violating the NFL's policy and program for substances of abuse, which is something I've never heard of before. How do you give a suspended player a contract extension, and then when he returned to the lineup, he wasn't very effective? This doesn't do anything to diminish the Fitzpatrick selection because Miami added an excellent player and a person by all accounts, but it does bring into question the wisdom and decision-making of the powers that be within the organization. With all that being said, Minkah Fitzpatrick is the headliner, being the first-round pick, so he'll have the highest expectations surrounding him. I expect him to make a big positive impact this season, and that is what we should all anticipate as he joins a defense that ranked 29th in the league in points allowed per game at nearly 25. As for the selections on days 2 and 3, the Dolphins entered the weekend having a huge void at the tight end position, and they helped fill that void by drafting a tandem of tight ends, the first being Penn State's Mike Gesicki in the second round, and the other being Notre Dame's Durham Smythe in the fourth. Gesicki is coming to Miami with a reputation for being a freakish athlete, 6'6", 252 pounds, ran a 4.54 40-yard dash with a 41.5-inch vertical. In his final 2 seasons at Penn State, he totaled 105 receptions for 1,242 yards and 14 touchdowns. He's a pass-receiving tight end who can make an immediate impact doing just that, but he's considered a very poor blocker, and that's something that he and the Dolphins coaching staff will have to work to develop. But I do think he can instantly play the role of Julius Thomas, who didn't block well either, but actually can make some impact plays unlike Thomas. Go up, win some jump balls, and perhaps finally give Ryan Tannehill a reliable, big-bodied athletic target in the red zone. Smythe comes in with the opposite reputation as Gesicki. Smythe is known for his blocking prowess and is an adequate receiver. In fairness, he wasn't used a lot in Notre Dame's offense as a threat in the passing game, but ultimately these two should complement each other well, and if things work out the way Miami is hoping, it will have its duo at that position for many years to come. In the third round, the Dolphins picked Jerome Baker, the linebacker from Ohio State. He will be reunited in the Fins linebacking core with fellow Buckeye Raekwon McMillan, Miami's second rounder from last year. Baker is another fast, athletic player who ran a 4.53 40 at the Combine, who should be able to improve Miami's coverage ability from the linebacker position immediately. His selection also fills a major need, and he'll be in contention to start right off the bat, considering McMillan and Kiko Alonso are the two presumed starters of the position, but they need a third linebacker in their base 4-3 defense. By being selected with the 73rd overall pick in the draft, Baker joins some esteemed company in Dolphins history. On 5 previous occasions, the Dolphins have drafted a player at number 73. Those players include Kenyon Drake out of Alabama in 2016, offensive guard John Jerry from Ole Miss in 2010, Jason Taylor, defensive end out of Akron in 1997. In 1988, Farrell Edmonds, the tight end out of Maryland, and defensive back Dick Anderson from Colorado in 1968. So you've got a pair of Hall of Famers in JT and Dick Anderson. Hopefully that bodes well for Baker at number 73. Sticking with the linebacker position, Miami added Ohio's Quinton Poling in the 7th round, who put up some athletic numbers in his own right in the pre-draft testing and should be an instant contributor on special teams. As for the other selections, running back Kalen Ballage out of Arizona State has impressive measurables but did split carries the last 2 seasons. He has the build, speed, and athleticism to develop nicely behind Kenyon Drake and Frank Gore, and is a good receiver out of the backfield. 6th-round cornerback Cornell Armstrong has the distinction of being the first cornerback out of Southern Miss drafted by the Dolphins since Patrick Surtain in the 2nd round in 1998. And the Dolphins presumably found their new kicker in 7th rounder Jason Sanders out of New Mexico. One note on him, I do have a lot of faith in special teams coordinator Darren Rizzi. He had major input in this decision and will get the most out of Sanders as he steps in as Miami's kicker. That's an overview of the draft class. You'll notice, as I stated at the top, Miami didn't add any help on the interior of the defensive line or at the quarterback position. Considering they released the anchor of their defense in Ndamukong Suh, I assumed they would acquire at least one defensive tackle to add to the group of Jordan Phillips, Devon Godshaw, and Vincent Taylor. And then the quarterback position is curious. The decision makers have repeatedly said this offseason that they have complete faith in Ryan Tannehill as the team's quarterback, and their draft certainly indicated that. I thought there was a chance the Dolphins would move up to select one of the top 4 QBs in the first round. But when they didn't, I was under the impression that they would surely address the position in the middle rounds of the draft, maybe even the 2nd or 3rd. Instead, they didn't address the position at all. I was really surprised by this move, and I'm concerned as well. The organization clearly has a lot of faith in Tannehill, and some of the fan base does as well, but I remain highly skeptical. I like Ryan as a person and know that he works extremely hard, so it's not about that. But has there ever been a point in time in which you could definitively say he's the Dolphins' franchise quarterback? Ask yourself that question. I haven't been able to say yes, definitively he's the franchise quarterback. There have always been questions and doubts. Add to that the fact that he's returning from back-to-back ACL injuries in the same knee and hasn't taken a snap in the NFL since early December of 2016. My goodness, I have many concerns regarding him and the position when you consider Brock Osweiler and David Fales are waiting in the wings. With that in mind, why not draft a QB at some point in this year's draft to develop and provide some competition? In the short term, that quarterback could compete for the backup role, and in the long term, ideally that player provided Tannehill with some healthy competition. Because alarmingly, Tannehill hasn't had any competition during his tenure in Miami since his rookie season. During that time, Matt Moore has been the backup, and Brandon Doughty was the only draft pick spent on the position in the 7th round, and he's no longer on the roster. So that's my primary criticism of this draft class. The glaring lack of a quarterback is puzzling and continues a disturbing trend of what now has become misplaced faith in Ryan Tannehill. To summarize, the Dolphins' 2018 draft class is a solid group that filled needs and added depth with the potential to produce a star in Minkah Fitzpatrick. But my big question will remain why the quarterback position wasn't addressed. In closing, a fact that stood out to me while I was preparing for this year's draft is alarming, and it's that there are only 4 Dolphins draft picks still on the roster from before 2015. Jawan James, a 2014 first-round pick, Walt Aikens, also a 2014 selection in the 4th round, Ryan Tannehill, a 2012 first-round pick, and Rashad Jones, a 5th-round selection in 2010. Based on that meager number of 4 picks still on the roster from before 2015, let's hope this year's class has more staying power than some in recent memory, or we may be in for more of the same mediocrity that Dolphins fans have unfortunately become accustomed to over the last nearly 2 decades.